So in this discussion, we're going to talk about behavior analytic approaches to changing behavior. Some of the strategies that we're going to talk about, if you've ever heard of them before, may sound familiar to strategies that would be referred to as behavior modification. So these, again, could be behavior modification or behavior analysis. But as I talk about them, I'll talk about some basic principles, but I'll also talk about how they relate to public health settings. So before we begin this discussion, I want you to think about, in your own opinion, is behavior mostly caused by cognitive processes? Some of the models and theories that we've talked about so far: health belief model, self-efficacy theory, trans-theoretical model, largely dependent on cognitive processes. Or do you think that behavior is mostly caused by events outside the individual? These would be things that, again, don't happen in your mind necessarily. They're not psychological determinants, but they would be environmental, things that we could observe, things we could see, we could manipulate them easily. So I also want you to think about this in terms of motivation. Would paying a smoker to stop smoking, would that be an effective tobacco control strategy? Do you think it's unethical to pay a smoker to stop smoking? As you're considering those last two questions, look at this video real quickly.
If a health scare doesn't do the trick, maybe money will. When a large company offered employees financial incentives to quit smoking, they were more likely to kick the habit, according to a new study. Smokers who were paid up to $750 in incentives were much more likely to remain smoke-free a year later than those who only received information about quitting smoking.
So just as a brief example, and there are many others in the research literature and kind of practical applications where people have tried paying smokers to not smoke. And if the conditions are right and people are sufficiently motivated, yes, it can be very effective. You can pay smokers to stop smoking, and you can have better effectiveness or better results than if you don't pay them. Now, that raises some serious questions, and in many cases might even make students uncomfortable or angry, the idea that we might pay someone to not do a bad behavior that they should know that they shouldn't do. And certainly I'm sympathetic to that point of view. One might also consider, or might consider an alternative perspective, and that is that we spend a lot of money rectifying or remedying or correcting people's bad choices. So when they go to the emergency room with acute respiratory conditions as a result of their smoking, and perhaps they're not in a position to pay for it, or even if they are and they've got insurance, insurance premiums across the board will go up, and so one might say, well, we're already paying substantially more, considerably more, by doing nothing, and so this might be a better alternative despite some uncomfortable feelings that it does evoke. Well, part of, in behavior analysis or behavior modification, trying to understand behavior is so that we can predict behavior. So if we know what such and such or what so-and-so is going to do under the specific conditions, then we'll be in a better position to change the conditions so that the behavior doesn't happen. So if we understand the exact conditions which evoke or elicit certain types of behaviors, then we can change or alter the situation or the environment so that that behavior doesn't occur. Well, as it turns out, and these are kind of lighthearted predictions of behavior, but they were very bad. So for example, 1943, I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. And of course, That has turned out to be crazy. In fact, many people have 5 computers in their own homes. Everything that can be invented has been invented, from the U.S. Office of Patents in 1899. These are fun. Apple is slated to come out with a new phone, and it will largely fail. And of course, that was the iPhone. There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. And Steve Ballmer, of course, the well-known executive at Microsoft, and so these are bad predictions of behavior. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why we want to be able to predict behavior is not so that we can be gypsies, but so that we can be able to understand the conditions that evoke those behaviors, so that we can alter those conditions. And that's, roughly speaking, something that we call stimulus control, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay, so some of the terms that we're going to be talking about, and if you've ever had an introduction to psychology or a behavior modification class, a lot of these terms will be very familiar, so you will have heard them before. We'll talk about them in a little bit more depth here, hopefully. And these ones that I've circled are the ones that are probably most important, that we'll talk most about. Environment, stimulus, respondent behavior, operant behavior, contingencies, behavioral consequences, operant conditioning, response class, positive reinforcement, unconditioned reinforcement, conditioned reinforcement, extinction, antecedent stimulus. That's an important one, and in the 3-term contingency. Okay, so little historical perspective. I want to distinguish between operant and respondent conditioning. So operant and respondent conditioning. Respondent conditioning I'm going to talk about first, and this is the paradigm, if you're familiar with Ivan Pavlov, who was the Russian physiologist. And I'm going to show you just a brief video clip in a second. Operant conditioning was championed by B.F. Skinner. And essentially, or the difference between operant and respondent conditioning hopefully will be clear in just a few minutes, but let me show you a brief video clip about Ivan Pavlov and respondent conditioning.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheeks so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps he thought the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee-jerk. After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex. But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food. He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Okay, so what you saw here was Ivan Pavlov's work with dogs. Now, let me break down a couple of key terms. One of them is an unconditioned stimulus. Now, meat or meat powder is an unconditioned stimulus, which means that you don't have to learn to like it. Or in the case of a dog, he doesn't have to learn to like that or to salivate. And of course, the salivation is an indication that the dog is expecting food, and so the digestive processes have already initiated on the inside of the mouth. Now, this would happen, this happens to you as well. Think about Fast Sunday, for example. You're hungry, you haven't had anything to eat for a little while, and you go into somebody's house and they're baking cookies, or there's microwave popcorn, something that gives off a big odor, or a very strong odor, and a pleasurable one, preferably. And you may notice a little burning sensation in the back of your mouth. Now, it's an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to learn to like the smell of cookies or of microwave popcorn. It's inherently reinforcing to you and elicits this response, this little burning sensation, which means that you are, much like the dog was, salivating. The digestive processes have already initiated. Okay, that's an unconditioned stimulus, something you don't have to learn to like. Food, water, love, emotion, support, social support, sex, those sorts of things we call them unconditioned stimuli. You don't have to learn to like them, they're inherently reinforcing.